Our scripture for today is in Genesis 22. If you want to turn there, it's Genesis 22, verse 2, 5, 8, and 15 through 18. I'll be reading from the New King James Version. Then he said, "Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." And Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you." And Abraham said, "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering." So the two of them went together. Skipping down to verse 15, then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." May the Lord add his blessing to the reading of his word this morning.
Amen. And that's the blessing I want for honoring God. He promises us blessing. So we looked at Abraham and we looked at Sarah, and now we're looking particularly at Isaac, and I'm kind of somewhat backing up because we're talking about this particular experience that is a part of the Abraham story, but we're looking at it because Isaac had to dedicate himself to God too. He's 20 years old. Now back up a little bit. Remember, Isaac was a promised, prayed for child. And the prayers were answered in such a way that God told him, "Name the kid Laughter." Both Abraham and Sarah took their turns at laughing, saying, "We're too old for this." And God said, "No. Nothing is too hard for me. You're going to have this kid." Sarah's 90, Abraham is 100, and they have this child. And they call him Laughter. I believe Isaac was an easy child to raise. Now, if you have more than one, you probably have some idea what I'm talking about. If you only have one child, you may not understand this, but some children are easier than others. And some of you may not have any children. You may not have any clue about this, but just look around and you'll see that some children seem to get into trouble a lot and some don't. Well, I find as a substitute teacher, the names I learn first are the names of the students that are having trouble with their classes, because I have to pull them out and help them to get caught up. So Isaac was an easy child to raise. He was wanting to do what his parents wanted him to do. He wanted to learn what his parents wanted to teach him. He wanted to obey. He was this kind that we just a delight to have around all the time. And he grew up in this setting that was, well, it's pretty special. He is the heir apparent, the crown prince of a lot of wealth. But he was humble about it. He wasn't arrogant or proud. He was handling this with grace. His father Abraham had been all over this land of Canaan, and Abraham had a practice of building altars and offering sacrifices. As Isaac got old enough, Abraham started introducing Isaac to these various altars where he had been doing the sacrifices, so Isaac could find them and keep sacrifices going. So Isaac had learned about doing sacrifices. Now Isaac's 20 years old. We tend to think of that as beginning to be just almost an adult. Maybe you even think it is an adult. I waited till I was 21 to get married. Some are waiting much longer than that these days. Isaac was 20 years old, and God spoke to Abraham. We have the story. Thank you, Nathan, for reading that story. a shocking story, because this is the God who says, "Thou shalt not kill." This is the God who sent Abraham into a territory where they were sacrificing their children to idols, and he was telling them, that's not appropriate. Love those children, don't kill those children. And just on the side here, there's still the same problem today. We're not blood and gore sacrificing them literally, but what we're giving them for entertainment is, blood and gore. Messy. And if you think that children can watch 2,000 murders before they become adults and have it not affect their mind, you just are willingly ignorant. These things impact us. So, enough on that. Abraham was told by God, a voice that he had heard often, woke him up in the middle of the night and said, "Take now thy son, thine only son, Isaac, whom you love, and sacrifice him on a mountain that I will tell you about." You can just imagine Abraham. He wakes up and he says, "God, was that you? Okay, I know it was you, but I can't. How can you say such a thing?" I can see him going over to Sarah's bed and looking at Sarah and saying, "Should I wake her up and let her have a last hug with her boy?" But then he says, "No, I don't dare, because she might not let me do what God has told me to do." We had to be very careful not to interfere with the service of God in those of our family members. We need to empower and encourage them to do whatever God tells you to do, even if it means that they're missionaries halfway around the world. So, he finally goes over and wakes up his son Isaac. "Isaac, we've got to go and do a sacrifice." He does not tell Isaac what the sacrifice is all about. It's premature. It's not time yet. He wakes him up, and Isaac says, "Okay, Dad, I'm ready." He's up and ready. And they get a couple of the servants and a donkey for some supplies, and they head out. Early morning. Sarah wakes up and sees that the men folk are gone, and she says, they're probably out doing some sacrifice. She's not worried at all. What she doesn't know. This was, I believe, Abraham's longest, hardest day. He's walking with his son, happy, carefree son, going where he's going. I'm going off to do a sacrifice with Dad, and Dad knows what he's been told to do. And Dad is going through, "God, how does this mesh with the rest of what you've told me? How is this real life?" They come to evening, and they choose a place to rest, and they pitch camp, and everybody gets tucked in except Abraham can't sleep. He spends the night in prayer. And the next day gets up and keeps going. He has an idea where, he's pointed in the right direction, but he doesn't know the particular mountain yet, but he's going. And another day of waiting. "God, can't you give me something more?" And God does not. Sometimes God does this to us, that he gives us a specific instruction. This is what I want you to do, but he doesn't give us the next step. We have to go in faith, trusting that when it's time, he'll give us the instruction. I learned that with a couple of important people in my life, that when I was told what to do, I had to just get started doing what I understood, trusting that my daddy was real good at this. When I needed the next step, he'd be there to tell me, "And now you do such and such." God does this. God starts us on a path and expects us to go forward when we don't know where we're stepping, but we take the next step and there's the solid ground below, and he takes care of us. Abraham spent another sleepless night. So now he's getting leveraged out on sleep deprivation, and he's also wrestling. And how does he survive this? Because he keeps rehearsing the promises of God. And he remembers that even in that waking him up, God had said, "Isaac, your only son, whom you love, and that God had said to him previously, in Isaac shall your seed be called, and he reviews these promises. We need to learn to fix our minds on heavenly themes, refuse to allow ourselves to be drugged down into the news and views of common life so that we can follow God implicitly. So now, after that second sleepless night, Abraham gets up and they ready to start off when he sees a halo of glory on a hilltop, just a little bit farther north of him. So he tells the young man who's with him, take care of the livestock, two donkeys they got, and wait here. And did you notice that phrase? What a statement of faith. In verse 5, Abraham says to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. Notice that he says, we. He has faith. And we get over into Hebrews 11, and we read that Abraham's faith was that God could raise him up from the dead. This is the promise of God, and I'm trusting that he's going to bring this to fruition. We will come back to you. So, the story goes on. You can follow along. I don't need to read it to tell you how it goes. On the way up the mountain, Isaac, who has been happy with Dad, and we're going, and Dad's got lots of flocks and herds scattered all over Palestine, and he's got friends everywhere, so we don't need to carry the sheep with us for the sacrifice. Dad can pick it up on the way. Well, now they're on the way up the mountain, and somebody suggested that Isaac was wondering if maybe Dad's getting a little senile. Dad, we've got the wood, and you notice who's carrying the wood? Isaac is carrying the wood. Who carried the cross? Don't miss the parallel here between Jesus carrying our sins and Isaac. It's rich. I think that's one of the most significant reasons that God gave Abraham this test, is for us to get somewhat of a picture of what the cross cost God and Jesus. So, on the way up the mountain, don't let me get too distracted from the story. And Isaac says, Dad, you're carrying the fire, I've got the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? And it's not time yet for Abraham to tell Isaac that he's the sacrifice. So he gives him a prophetic answer and a statement of faith. Verse 8. Son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. Does it get any richer than that? What a statement of faith. Jesus is the lamb, and all the lambs that have been sacrificed, thousands, millions of lambs have been sacrificed, and every one of them pointed forward to Jesus. And now Abraham, giving him somewhat of a put-off answer, says, Son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. I don't think this is primarily pointing to the ram that we're going to find caught in a thicket later. I think this is primarily pointing to Jesus, who is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Well, they get up to the top of the mountain, they repair the altar, and then and God spares us the details of this part of the story. But if you're a father, if you're a mother, if you've loved any child, you can just imagine the pathos as Abraham says, Son, we've got to talk. Now, there are times when we have father-son talks, and we should always have father-son talks, but it doesn't get any heavier than this one. God has told me that you are the sacrifice of this time. And I'm sure he told him, now, son, I don't know how God's going to work this out, but he's also promised that you are the progenitor of a whole host of family, and even that the Christ child will be born in your line. All these things, and he says, son, I'm just having to go in faith. Now here we find the beauty of Isaac's faith. Isaac said, Dad, it's okay. Now you think about this. The old man, 120 years old. I know, you think you're old at 94? That's great. But 120? Isaac is 20 years old. He's in the flush of youthful health. He could say, Dad, no way. I'm out of this. You do whatever you want to do, but I'm going home. He could easily have walked away. But he says, Dad, if that's what God said for you to do, I'm with you. We had a baby dedication here. Well, here was a dedication. I think it's precious that in God's timing, Lucas is dedicated on the very same day that we're talking about Isaac's dedication. I know there was a dedication when he was a baby, of course, because it was part of those rules. But this time, now that's serious dedication. I can picture him getting up on the altar, laying down and saying, Dad, you really better tie my hands. I don't think you wanted a blindfold on, but Dad, I think you should tie my hands down because I might interfere. I might just, there's automatic responses when I see a knife over my head that tie my hands down. And so he does. And they have their last prayer, their last hug, their last kiss. Abraham raises the knife. And then God speaks. God doesn't speak before we need to hear his voice, but he always speaks when we need to hear his voice. And some of you here have heard his voice. Sometimes it's an audible voice, sometimes it's less than that. Yeah, I have some notes here I should cover. People ask me, Pastor, why would God require such a test of Abraham? Well, remember, Abraham is in this holy line. We talked in Sabbath school a lot about Noah, and we touched on Noah's father Lamech and more about his grandfather Methuselah. Abraham's in this line, and God needs people who are completely dedicated. And Abraham had done pretty well, but he'd done some very serious, you actually did that? He lied about his wife. I know, she's his sister and he called her sister. But that was a lie. We talked about that before. Twice. Well, we got to move past that somehow. And this was part of moving past that. He took a second wife, Hagar. And God had already said, no, one wife's enough. Precious truth we know, one wife's enough. God had given us this instruction, and Abraham, following the practice of the world around, had taken Hagar and confused things with this other son who has now gotten married and had children and has stopped being a worshiper of God and started participating in the idol worship that his mother and his wives were participating in. Abraham understood that stuff. And God said, Abraham, I need you to make a statement of implicit trust in me. This test of Abraham and the test of Isaac was an opportunity to make a commitment, a clean, wholehearted commitment. Now, I've already alluded to this, but let me make sure you remember. When God said, that's enough, stop, don't kill the boy, I don't need to raise him from the dead, he is, in a figure, raised from the dead by the stopping of the sacrifice. They looked around and there was a ram caught in a thicket. And people say, well, was that ram in the thicket all the time? We're not told. Did God just suddenly introduce and magically produce a ram in the thicket? We're not told. Sometimes things are just so plain, but we don't see them until it's time. It was there. And that's what we're told. It was there. Miraculously provided at the time it was needed. And that too points to Jesus. They did have a sacrifice on that mountaintop. And it was a ram that God provided. God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. Yes, so much fulfillment in that. This is pointing to Jesus, and John 3:16, God so loved that he gave. He did not give Jesus merely for 33 years on this earth. God gave Jesus to be part of the human family forever. I don't think we yet understand what that means. I think that in some manner, Jesus has permanently limited himself to our human form. And you can read more about that in Philippians chapter 2. What a gift. What a statement of love that God has given to us in the gift of Jesus. We should just be falling in love with him more and more each day. Well, there are two crises in Isaac's life that I want us to look at. We'll just touch on a third, but two particular crises in his life that I look at with this Isaac experience. Isaac chose to wait in the godly pattern for his parents to provide the bride for him. Now, in today's society, we expect the children to pick their own spouse. And sometimes they don't do very well. And sometimes the parents say, I wish I could have. Well, in the godly pattern, it may be okay for the young people to be looking and making the suggestions, but they should always be seeking counsel. And that's what we see in this story. Abraham knew that there's nobody in the camp that's right for Isaac, and there's nobody in the surrounding territory that's right for Isaac. They've all been too involved in idol worship. He needs to have a wife who will support and strengthen him in his worship of the true God. Abraham knew that Isaac's yielding and helpful disposition would easily be swayed by a godless wife. There's a danger there. So Abraham invited his most trusted servant, one apparently who was born in Mesopotamia, into his own family and had been raised in the family, and he's got to be in his 80s or 90s. He's an old man now. But Abraham says, Eliezer, I want you to go back to Haran, to my kinfolk, because he knew that his kinfolk still worshiped God. Some of their worship was polluted with some idolatry, but he said, I'm sure God's got somebody picked out. God can give us these understandings without necessarily a specific vision that he saw a picture of the girl and told him who. No, but God could tell him, this is where you need to go. And Eliezer took that swearing very seriously. It's a very, the biblical phrase for that, Hebrew is a very rich language, and sometimes one word can have a handful of meanings, and so you go into the culture and you discover, oh, that's what it meant. Eliezer had a very serious agreement with Abraham, and he took 10 camels. We'll touch on that in another story we'll get to. Took 10 camels of stuff and went to Mesopotamia, where he would look for this bride. And you have that story so preciously told. He's at the well. He knows at the right place. And he says, God, I'm trusting you to take charge of this. I'm going to invite a pretty girl and often there's some kind of symbol in a culture, whether she's married or not married. Some cultures, they wear a flower on one side of the head if it's married, and on the other side of the head if they're not married. When we do graduation at our college and high school, we move the tassel from one side to the other. Those are symbols of where you stand. I'm sure in that culture there were indicators that this is a marriageable girl and that's an already married girl, so he could tell. And so he chose somebody that he was somewhat attracted to, and he gave God a restriction. He said, God, if this is the right one, when I ask her for a drink of water for me, she'll not only give me a drink of water, but she'll water my camels. Now, giving him a drink of water would be nothing. In the East, even if you are an enemy, known to be an enemy, and you say, would you please give me a drink of water, they're obligated to give you a drink of water. Water is considered life, and if you've asked for water for someone, you're considered, if you don't give them water, you're considered to be killing them. So it raises the stand quite high. Well, he asked for water, and none of those issues would be raised. He's a stranger. She has no idea who he is. He obviously wants a drink. She gives him a drink. And then she looks and fulfills the pledge that he had said to God, and she says, let me water your camels. Now, you know how much water a camel takes? They can drink gallons of water. I have heard that they can drink 20 to 40 gallons of water. Well, how much is she going to be carrying in her water pot? If you put 5 gallons of water on your shoulder, you've got a lot of water. She had to make a number of trips down to the well, back up to the water trough, down to the well, back up to the water trough to water those camels. And meanwhile, Eliezer saying, praise God. Here is a woman who's not afraid of work, a woman who is ready to be gracious to strangers, a woman who's eager to be helpful. God, you have provided. So he knows what he's getting. And he reaches in and gets some jewelry to put on her, and very well rewarded for a few hours or minutes, probably an hour of work. Very well rewarded, if just the money was what was involved. But that was a symbol of much more. He asks her if there's a place where he can stay, and she says, yeah, my family will put you up. And so she runs home, tells her daddy, Bethuel, and her brother Laban, and they say, oh my, they see the jewelry, and they say, well, this is somebody we want to entertain. And so Laban runs down there and says, we've got everything already, straw and provender and food. We'll take you, we'll give you the royal treatment. Eliezer says, thank you. Eliezer knows what's going on. They don't yet know what's going on. They think they're going to get enriched out of this. They are, but not the way they expected. As soon as they get there, Eliezer says to them, before I eat with you, I need to tell you what I'm here for. And so he explains to them, Abraham sent me, I came, I made a bargain with God that the girl and that she, and they say, Eliezer, there's nothing we dare do to interfere with what God is doing for you. You're welcome to marry this girl. Now, I believe that Rebekah, while she was being raised in a family that was not pure in their worship of God, that she in her heart was pure in her worship of God. And sometimes God just picks one out of a family and helps them in the way of truth and righteousness for His glory. So, Abraham knew it was his responsibility, and he has waited an additional 20 years before he actually does this. Sarah has died, and Abraham says, if I'm going to have grandchildren, we better get going with this. And so he finally, when Isaac is 40 years old, he does what he should do and provides the wife. I'm recognizing that God can orchestrate this thing, but I'm also recognizing that from our humanness, sometimes we don't move as quickly as we should. We need to be in touch and keep praying. We'll get into that more when we get into Isaac's responsibility in that, but that's running ahead. One more part of this before we finish. after they got married, you can't miss this part of the story. Okay, they agree with Eliezer that she should go, and he says, well, let's go in the morning. And they say, oh, no, let us have a week or 2 weeks of saying goodbye. And he says, I really, really feel like I need to get back home and take her with me. And they say, well, we'll ask the girl. And so they call in Rebecca. Will you go with this man? And she says, yes, I'm going. We don't need to wait. We don't need to take 10 days or 2 weeks for a goodbye parties. We don't need the bridal showers. We don't need that stuff. I can go. He had explained to them the wealth of Abraham and that she was marrying into a very princely family. She was going to be the queen. Sarah has already died. She becomes the matriarch of the family as the new bride. So she comes to the family. They're riding their camels, and they see Isaac. Isaac has been involved in various parts, but he knows it's about time for them to get back. So he's at the home farm now, and he sees them, and he's going out to meet them. I learned on Strong Tower Radio something that I hadn't thought of before. It says that she, as soon as she knew that it was her husband on the way, betrothed, she got off the camel and put on a veil. Well, I thought that she was just being shy. I don't want him to see my face until it's time. And we have those traditions about the groom not seeing the bride on the day of the wedding until she's starting down the aisle. You know how that goes. That's what I thought it was. But then on Strong Tower, a preacher was pointing out, she did not want to meet her betrothed from up on a camel. She wanted to meet him as face to face rather than being lording it over him when she first meets him. And yeah, okay, that makes sense. So she alights from the camel and they meet. Okay, it's very simple what it says. He took her into his mother's tent and she became his wife. Rich stuff in that, but that's clear enough. 20 years go by with them being intimate as husband and wife and no babies. Rebecca says, hubby, don't you think it's time that you talk to God about this? She initiates it, and Isaac says, okay, and Isaac prays, and God answers, and she gets pregnant. We can pretend that having babies is a very human thing, but every baby is a miracle from heaven, and we need to treasure that. And of course, we'll get into more of that story when we get into the next one, but that's enough for now. Some lessons, really serious lessons for us. Trust God. God will provide. He'll provide everything you need. Trust Him and move forward in faith. Let God direct the affairs of your life. Yes, you should plan ahead. Yes, you should do what you can, but always expect God to do the guiding, particularly in the issues of marriage. But plenty of other needs, you know what they are. Life work, what service you should be doing. When issues arise, turn to God first. That's a rich one from all of this Abraham story, and now Isaac. Make God your first line of defense. Talk to God about it, and He will bring it to pass. He will direct and guide. He will glorify Himself in us. May God bless you.